In the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, everyone agreed that Louise Tanner was the calmest woman they had ever known. She volunteered at the library 3 mornings a week, brought casseroles to funerals before anyone thought to ask, and answered every difficult question with the same even, unhurried tone. People sometimes mistook her calm for simplicity, as though a woman who never raised her voice had nothing underneath it worth raising a voice about. Louise let them believe that. She had been letting people believe convenient, incomplete things about her for over 30 years, and she had grown so skilled at it that most days, even she nearly believed the smoothed-over version of her own life story. Louise had her own private rituals nobody in the family ever noticed closely enough to question. Every April, on the anniversary of the crash, she planted something new in the small flower bed along the side of the house. Nothing dramatic. Usually just a few bulbs from the hardware store, done alone on a Saturday morning, while Richard, and later Daniel, assumed she simply enjoyed gardening. She kept a single hymn on a scratched record she never played in front of anyone, the one her mother had once suggested for a wedding that never happened. These small, unremarked habits were the only rooms in her life where grief was allowed to exist without an audience, and she had built them carefully enough, over 3 decades, that not even Richard ever fully understood what April meant to her. The night Daniel and his wife Naomi announced they were expecting their first child, the whole family gathered at Louise's kitchen table, and for one unguarded second, before she caught herself, something crossed Louise's face that had nothing to do with joy. It was there and gone in under a second, a flicker of old grief surfacing at the mention of a baby who would, God willing, carry pieces of people long buried. Naomi noticed it and said nothing, assuming it was simply the tears of a proud grandmother. Daniel didn't notice at all. Louise recovered so quickly that by the time dessert was served, she was laughing at something Naomi said, exactly the way everyone expected her to. 34 years earlier, Louise had been engaged to a different Tanner brother entirely. Grant Tanner was 2 years older than Richard, quick to laugh, restless in a way that made small-town Millbrook feel, when she was with him, like somewhere worth staying. They had planned a June wedding, had already chosen invitations, had already told Louise's mother which hymn to play. Grant worked long hours at his father's lumber yard and complained sometimes of dizziness he blamed on the heat, spells he waved off with the easy confidence of a 29-year-old who had never once been seriously sick in his life. Louise told him, more than once, to see a doctor. Grant always promised he would, eventually, once the wedding was behind them. Louise remembered, decades later, one particular evening with Grant on the porch of his parents' house, the two of them arguing gently over whether to invite his second cousins to the wedding, Grant laughing so hard at his own joke about the guest list that he nearly knocked over her lemonade. She remembered thinking, watching him that evening, that she had never once in her life felt as certain of anything as she felt of him. It was an ordinary memory, unremarkable at the time, and it became, after his death, one of only a handful of evenings she allowed herself to revisit in detail, careful never to wear it thin from overuse, the way grief sometimes wears down the very memories it's trying to protect. He never got the chance. 6 weeks before the wedding, Grant was driving alone to pick up the finished invitations on a clear April afternoon, when his car drifted across the center line without any weather or road condition to explain it, and struck an oncoming truck. The county coroner's report noted, almost as an afterthought beneath the more obvious injuries, evidence suggesting Grant had likely lost consciousness at the wheel, a fact nobody in the grieving family fully absorbed at the time, a detail too clinical to matter beside the plain fact that Grant was gone. Louise stood at his funeral in the dress she'd already altered for her own wedding, unable to explain to anyone why she felt not only grief but a specific, unbearable guilt for every time she had let his dizzy spells go unquestioned. 5 weeks after the funeral, Louise understood why her body had felt strange in ways grief alone didn't explain. She was pregnant with Grant's child, in a town where, in that era, an unmarried pregnant woman was discussed in careful, lowered voices at church socials for years afterward. Louise refused, though she had no plan at all for what staying would actually require of her. only a stubborn refusal to let shame chase her out of the one place that still held Grant's memory in its streets and porches, and the lumber yard where he'd worked every summer since he was 15. Naomi had married into the Tanner family 3 years earlier, and had loved Louise from the start, with the particular gratitude of a woman whose own mother had never once managed to say a kind word without also attaching a criticism to it. She had noticed, long before the pregnancy, that Louise sometimes went quiet in ways that seemed to cost her something, though Naomi had always assumed it was simply grief for Richard, still fairly fresh at 3 years. She made a private habit of including Louise in every part of the pregnancy she could, driving her to appointments when Daniel couldn't, half because she wanted the company, and half because some instinct told her Louise needed to feel useful to something new and living, rather than only tending old memories alone in a flower bed each April. Richard Tanner had loved Louise quietly for 3 years before his brother ever asked her to the county fair, a fact he had never once mentioned to Grant, or to Louise, or to anyone, because loving your brother's fiancée felt, to Richard, like a kind of theft he refused to commit even in his own head. After Grant's death, Richard visited Louise every week, not out of romantic intention at first, only because someone in the family needed to check on her, and Richard was the one who kept finding reasons to be the one who did. When he learned about the pregnancy, sitting across from her at the same kitchen table where Daniel would announce his own child 3 decades later, Richard didn't hesitate the way anyone watching from outside might have expected him to. "Marry me," he said, "and let people believe whatever they want. I'll raise him like he's mine, because as far as anyone needs to know, he will be." Louise argued with him for 2 full weeks, insisting he deserved a wife who came to him without another man's child already inside her, without a grief she suspected she would carry quietly for the rest of her life, regardless of what Richard offered. Richard's answer never changed. He told her, plainly, that he had already lost the brother he loved, and he refused to also lose the closest thing left of him without at least trying to love it properly. They married in September, 5 months after Grant's funeral, in a ceremony the whole town quietly agreed not to do the math on. Daniel was born the following February, and from his first hour of life, Richard held him the way a man holds something he has already decided, privately and permanently, belongs to him. Nobody in Millbrook ever raised the question out loud, not even Grant and Richard's own mother, who occasionally studied Daniel's face at Sunday dinners with an expression Louise learned to redirect before it could fully form into a sentence. Louise built, over the following decade, a whole private language of deflection. A laugh here, a change of subject there, a comment about the Hartley side of the family, whenever anyone mentioned that Daniel didn't much resemble either Tanner brother around the eyes. She never once told an outright lie. She simply never volunteered the truth, and eventually, silence became its own kind of fluency. Grant had written 1 letter before he died, sealed and addressed simply to "My child," given to Louise by his mother 2 months after the funeral. Once the older woman had done the arithmetic, Louise had hoped nobody would attempt. Louise never opened it. She kept it instead in a shoebox at the top of her closet, beneath a stack of old photographs, for 34 years, telling herself each year that the right moment to give it to Daniel simply hadn't arrived yet. Some part of her understood, even as she told herself that she was also protecting herself, that opening the door to Grant's handwriting meant opening a door to a grief she had spent 3 decades carefully keeping behind glass. Richard had his own quiet burden, one Louise didn't fully understand until many years into their marriage. He had been the one who convinced Grant to take extra shifts at the lumber yard that final spring, wanting to help his brother save toward the wedding, never imagining that exhaustion and heat and an undiagnosed heart condition were quietly working against Grant in ways no one in the family had the vocabulary to notice. Richard carried a private conviction, never once spoken aloud in 3 decades, that he had pushed his brother toward the very afternoon that killed him. He raised Daniel, in part, as a kind of ongoing apology to a dead man who would never hear it, and Louise only pieced this together slowly, watching how carefully Richard always avoided ever complaining about long work hours himself. Daniel grew up entirely certain of who his father was. Richard taught him to fish, attended every school event, argued with him about curfews, and cried without embarrassment at his college graduation. And nothing about that love ever announced itself as anything other than what it appeared to be. Louise watched the two of them build an ordinary, sturdy father-son relationship across 2 decades, and every year that passed made the idea of disrupting it with the truth feel more impossible rather than less. By the time Daniel married Naomi, Louise had convinced herself the secret had become, in some sense, harmless. A private fact, belonging only to a past that no longer touched anyone's present. Richard died 3 years before Daniel and Naomi's pregnancy announcement, at 72, of what the hospital called a sudden cardiac event, unrelated, the doctors assured Louise, to anything hereditary. Simply the ordinary wearing down of an aging heart. Louise had grieved him fully and honestly, in a way she'd never quite allowed herself to grieve Grant, because grieving Richard required no careful management of what she was allowed to say out loud. She missed him plainly, the way a wife misses a husband of 41 years. And it was only now, watching Naomi's pregnant belly across the kitchen table, that an old fear Louise thought she'd buried alongside Grant began quietly stirring itself back awake. At 20 weeks, a routine screening flagged an irregular marker in the baby's early cardiac scan. Nothing alarming yet, the doctor said, but worth monitoring, and worth understanding whether anything similar ran in either side of the family. Naomi asked Daniel to fill out a family medical history form that evening, and Daniel, sitting at his own kitchen table, called Louise to ask a question he had asked 100 times before, without either of them thinking twice about it. "Mom, did Dad's side of the family have any heart trouble?" Louise held the phone in silence for 3 long seconds, long enough that Daniel asked if she was still there, and understood, for the first time in 34 years, that the question had an actual answer she had never let herself say. Louise called her younger sister Vivian that same night, the only person left alive who had known the whole truth from the beginning, and admitted, for the first time out loud in decades, how frightened she was of what telling Daniel now might undo. Vivian listened for a long while before saying something that startled Louise more than anything else that day. "I've known for 34 years, Louise, and I've spent every one of them terrified you'd never tell him, not because of Richard, but because of what happens to a person's heart, in every sense of the word, from holding something that heavy alone for that long." Vivian's honesty didn't make the decision easier. It only made it clear that the decision could no longer wait for a more comfortable moment that was never actually going to arrive. Vivian had her own reasons for guarding the secret so completely for so long, reasons she only admitted to Louise that night on the phone. She had been 22 when Grant died, newly married herself, and had watched her older sister rebuild an entire life out of a tragedy nobody in Millbrook was equipped to discuss openly in that era. Keeping the secret had felt, to Vivian, like the one concrete way she could protect Louise from a town that had already shown how quickly it could turn a grieving young woman into a cautionary tale. It had never once occurred to Vivian, across 3 decades, to ask whether the protection had quietly become its own kind of cage. Not until she said it out loud to Louise for the first time, and heard how true it sounded the moment it left her mouth. Louise drove to Daniel and Naomi's house 2 days later with the shoebox from her closet on the passenger seat, Grant's sealed letter resting on top of the old photographs, like something finally being allowed daylight. She told Daniel everything at his own kitchen table, in the same even voice she had used to deflect every question about resemblance for over 3 decades, though this time the voice shook slightly near the end. She told him about Grant's dizzy spells, about the coroner's quiet note nobody had taken seriously, about Richard's proposal and the guilt he'd carried about those extra shifts, about a shoebox that had waited in a closet for a moment Louise had been too frightened to create herself. Daniel sat perfectly still through nearly all of it, the unopened letter trembling slightly in his own hands by the time she finished. Daniel did not speak for almost a full minute after Louise finished, staring at handwriting from a man he had never once, in 34 years, considered might be his father. Anger arrived before grief did, Sharper than Louise had braced herself for, not at Grant, and not entirely at Richard, but at the sheer scale of the arithmetic he'd apparently been living inside without ever once being handed the numbers. 34 years, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. You let me ask 100 stupid questions about why I don't look like either of you, and you just redirected me. Every single time. Louise didn't defend the years all at once. She only said that she understood, now, watching his face, that protecting him and being honest with him had never actually been the same thing, however much she'd once convinced herself they were. When he finally spoke again, his first real question wasn't about betrayal, though the anger would return in smaller waves over the following weeks. His first question was simpler and harder. Did Dad know he wasn't supposed to love me this much? Louise told him, honestly, that Richard hadn't merely known. Richard had decided, deliberately and completely, from the very first hour of Daniel's life, exactly how much he intended to love him, and had never once, in 41 years, treated that decision as anything less than permanent. Daniel cried harder at that answer than at anything else Louise told him that afternoon. He opened Grant's letter alone that night, in the room that would soon be a nursery, and read words a 29-year-old man had written in April, without knowing he had only weeks left to live, hopes for a wedding he never reached, plans for a life he never got to build, and a plain, unpolished wish that whatever child he and Louise might someday have would grow up brave enough to ask questions loudly rather than swallow them quietly the way, Grant admitted almost sheepishly in the letter, his own family always had. Daniel told Louise afterward that reading it felt less like meeting a stranger and more like recognizing, for the first time, exactly where his own stubborn refusal to let hard conversations go unfinished had actually come from. The following week, Daniel underwent genetic testing alongside the ongoing monitoring of the baby's cardiac marker, and the results, when they came back, carried a complicated kind of relief. Daniel did carry a mild variant of the same inherited arrhythmia that had likely caused Grant's fatal collapse at the wheel. The same condition, quite possibly, that no doctor had ever thought to look for in Richard either. Though Louise would never know that for certain now, because the family history had finally surfaced in time. Doctors could monitor Daniel properly, and could watch the baby's heart with real information instead of guesswork. It was, everyone agreed, exactly early enough to matter. 3 decades of silence had cost nothing medically in the end, only because Louise had finally broken it before the cost came due. What could not be recovered, no matter how completely Louise finally told the truth, was the chance for Richard to hear his own quiet heroism, spoken aloud while he was still alive to receive it. Louise found herself grieving him freshly in the weeks after telling Daniel, not because anything factual had changed about the man Richard had been, but because she understood now, with a clarity 3 decades of careful silence had never allowed her, exactly how much she had never told him either, how rarely she had said, in so many words, that his choice to love another man's son had been the single greatest act of love she had ever witnessed up close. She had let his actions speak for him for 41 years. It had never once occurred to her that he might have wanted, sometimes, to hear it said. Daniel visited Grant's grave for the first time, with full understanding of who lay beneath it, on a gray Saturday morning, 3 weeks after learning the truth, and stood there long enough that Naomi eventually joined him, without either of them speaking about why. The headstone was plainer than he'd expected, worn soft at the edges from 34 Ohio winters, and he found himself reading the dates twice, doing the same arithmetic his mother had spent 3 decades trying to keep him from ever needing to do. He did not feel, standing there, the anger he had braced himself for in the days after Louise's confession. He felt, instead, something closer to gratitude toward 2 men instead of 1, toward a father who had loved him with total, undivided devotion for 3 decades, and toward a stranger whose handwriting had somehow still managed to shape him in ways neither of them had ever gotten the chance to discuss out loud. Before they left, Daniel knelt and cleared a small patch of grass that had grown up over the base of the stone, an unplanned gesture that surprised him as much as it did Naomi. "I don't really know what to say to him," he admitted, still kneeling. Naomi told him he didn't have to say anything yet, that some conversations take longer than one visit to a cemetery to finish, and that Grant, of all people, seemed to have understood exactly that kind of patience when he wrote a letter to a child he'd never get to meet. Daniel nodded, pressed his palm briefly against the top of the stone, and walked back to the car without another word, though his shoulders looked, Naomi thought, noticeably lighter than when they'd arrived. The baby was born in early spring, 7 pounds and healthy, with a small, precautionary cardiac monitor attached for the first several months of life, simply because the family finally knew enough to ask the right questions in time. Louise held her grandson in the same hospital hallway where, decades earlier, she had once stood grieving a fiancé nobody in that building had thought to properly examine. Louise held her grandson in the same hospital hallway. She found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, telling Naomi the whole story plainly and without flinching, unprompted, simply because keeping it folded away no longer felt like protection. It felt, instead, like the last unnecessary weight she was finally setting down. In the months that followed, Louise did something she had not done in 34 years. She took Grant's photograph out of the shoebox and placed it beside Richard's on the mantel, side by side, without explanation to anyone who visited, and without apology either. Vivian noticed it the first time she came for dinner and said nothing, only reached over and straightened Grant's frame slightly, the way Louise had straightened Richard's 1,000 times over 4 decades. Daniel noticed it too, on his next visit, and stood in front of the mantel for a long moment before simply nodding once, as if some private accounting had finally balanced itself after 34 years of careful, silent arithmetic. Louise Tanner never set out to teach her family a lesson about honesty. She had simply decided, at 26 years old and terrified in a kitchen not unlike the one where she would one day tell her son everything, that protecting the people she loved mattered more than her own comfort with the truth. She kept deciding that, quietly, for 34 years, until a routine scan on an unborn grandchild finally made silence more dangerous than the secret itself. Nobody had ever asked her directly why she never complained, because there had never been a visible reason to ask. The reason had been waiting the entire time in a shoebox at the top of a closet, in a letter from a man who never got to raise his own son, and in the quiet, permanent love of a man who decided, one ordinary afternoon, that he would. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to MindMazeTales so you never miss any of our upcoming videos.